Welcome back to the program. And now we turn to journalists in the crosshairs. For generations, our colleagues have risked their lives and given their lives, covering wars and human disasters and uncovering important, ugly crimes and secrets. Over the past several years, the targets of these stories have started to turn their guns on the truth seekers. They really want to kill the messenger. Exactly 1 year ago, veteran foreign correspondent Marie Colvin, a legend in our profession, was killed by a shelling attack in Syria. French photographer Rémi Hochlik was killed alongside her. Marie always sought the very human side of war, and the night before she died, she called into CNN with this horrifying story from Homs in Syria.
The baby's death was just heartbreaking. Possibly because it was so quiet. One of the first shocks, of course, was the grandmother had been helping, completely coincidentally helping in the emergency room, and just started shouting, "That's my grandson, where did you find him?" And then the doctor said, "There's nothing we could do," and we just watched this little boy, his little tummy heaving and heaving as he tried to breathe. It was horrific. My heart broke.
Who can forget the picture that she painted with those words? And so many more people, children included, have been killed in Syria in the year since Marie died. British photographer Paul Conroy, who survived that attack, says that he is sure all of them were specifically targeted for their stories. The Committee to Protect Journalists says that 70 journalists were killed in 2012, a 49% increase from the previous year. 232 are imprisoned around the world, and 35 journalists are missing. A new campaign called A Day Without News is trying to raise awareness and bring penalties to those who target journalists. A leading voice for that campaign belongs to New York Times photographer Lindsay Addario. Covering the Libya revolution back in 2011, she was abducted with 3 colleagues and held for 6 terrifying days. She joined me from London, just back from a risky recent assignment in Syria. Lindsay Addario, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Lindsay, yet again, these shocking statistics about how deadly this is, and photographers such as yourself. What do you think is happening in the field? Why is it getting so much worse for us?
I think increasingly journalists are being targeted, especially on the front line. I think with the Arab Spring, there are regimes in place who don't want our coverage to get out. And it's very clear that we're becoming a target in a way that we were not in the past.
You have just come back from Syria. Were you on the front line, or what was your aim this time?
I was not on the front line after what happened in Libya in 2011 when I was kidnapped by Gaddafi. Other colleagues for the New York Times. I've sort of had a slow re-entry back in, and I've been wanting to cover Syria, but in a way that I felt comfortable doing it. And I felt like I didn't want to go directly back into combat, but I wanted to tell the story of how civilians were living on the front line, or being affected by the war more. And so I went in and I went to Aleppo province and went to villages, and really wanted to see how people were suffering shortages and what the situation was really.
That then leads me to make this conclusion that these direct attacks on us as a profession do have a chilling effect.
Of course they do. There are fewer and fewer journalists going into Syria. If you look at Libya, there were dozens of journalists on the front line, roaming all around eastern Libya, people who had never covered war before, people who had years and years of experience. That has changed exponentially, even in the last 2 years. There are only a handful of journalists who are covering Syria, because it has a lot to do with the killing of Marie Colvin and Rémi Hochlik. It has a lot to do with Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington's death in April of 2011. It is very clear that it is much more dangerous now to cover Syria than it has been to cover war in the past.
Well, you were kidnapped along with your colleagues in Libya. I want to play part of an interview that you did on CNN with Anderson Cooper shortly after you were released. So this is you and Anthony Shadid talking.
I remember one of the soldiers was yelling at me, "You're the translator, you're the spy." And then soon after that, they forced us on our stomachs. And I think we all had that very sinking feeling that this was it. It's hard to describe other than calling it resignation or emptiness, that, you know, that the moment's drawing near and you're kind of waiting for it.
Well, there's nothing you can do. You can't. You're literally captive, and you know that any move you make, they can shoot you. So it's almost easier to just not move and say, okay, I might die right now. And you resign to the fact that this could be the end.
What do you think when you hear what you said a couple of years ago?
I think that that is the truth. I think that when I've been kidnapped twice now, once outside of Fallujah in 2004 and once in Libya, and both times you realize that you have absolutely no power, that your best use of power is to stay quiet and be as submissive as possible, because people will do ultimately what they want to you, and so there's no point in fighting. But I think what's very important in that clip that you just played is sort of what wasn't said, and there was a moment when they lied, the four of us, on our stomachs, and it was Tyler Hicks, Steve Farrell, Anthony Shadid, and I, and they lied us on our stomachs, and they had their rifles to us, and they were deciding whether or not to kill us, and Anthony then translated for us later on saying, shoot them. No, you can't shoot them because they're American. Now, I think part of this campaign has to do with we're trying to get out the fact that you can't shoot them because they're journalists. It should be that journalists are exempt from targeted killings, that we should be understood as being a neutral observer who is there to document both sides of the conflict.
So Anthony Shadid, of course, did die. He died of a massive asthma attack, which was probably brought on by the terrible stress of being inside Syria. And this was a year ago. And it's really heartbreaking, actually, to see that interview. And also, you mentioned Marie Colvin, who died a year ago as well. And the survivors of that attack, Paul Conroy, for instance, strongly believes that Marie and Remy Ochlik were targeted. That building that they were in was specifically targeted, which goes to your point about targeting journalists.
That's exactly why we're starting this campaign. The Sunday Times has already announced that they will not take work from Syria from freelancers. Now, that is unprecedented, I think, in our profession, because traditionally freelancers have been the ones who go into the most dangerous places and then come out and sell their material. It's how I started. It's how many people started.
Well, indeed.
Now, if a war is too dangerous that an organization doesn't even want to take responsibility for giving the impetus for freelancers to go out there, then that speaks volumes about where we're at in terms of respecting journalists and letting them do their jobs.
You just mentioned the campaign. This is obviously a day without news. Sum up for us what precisely it means. What should somebody who's never heard of this understand from that phrase?
A day without news is literally, the name was given because you're supposed to imagine what would it be like if we actually didn't have any journalists in a situation and there was literally a day without news. And it's a campaign to bring awareness to the fact that there is a rise in targeting of journalists. And we want to create a forum where every time a journalist is targeted, that information is brought forward and and that there is a chance for the person who committed that crime to be persecuted. As of now, there are dozens, I think 132 journalists were killed last year alone. All of these journalists, no one is prosecuted. There is no one pays the price of killing journalists, so it makes it very easy for journalists to get targeted.
You're right. I've been to Russia, many other places where there's virtually no investigation, no prosecution, and no accountability for those who kill journalists. Are you looking for what, though? I mean, how do we make that happen? Who is going to police that cause?
I think right now in this stage of the campaign, we want to get the word out there. We want as many people as possible to understand what's happening on the front line, that more and more journalists are getting targeted and fewer journalists are able to cover major international stories like Syria. And at that point, eventually, it is a war crime already to kill a journalist because we are counted as a civilian. Now, that's a war crime, but have you ever heard of anyone ever being accountable for killing a journalist? No. So we want to get to the point where people are actually held accountable for killing journalists.
Lindsay Addario, thanks very much, and we'll continue to watch the campaign, A Day Without News.
Thank you so much.
A day without news is a phrase that's meant to grab our attention, but a world without journalists is a real and frightening possibility. When we come back, we'll pay homage to those who paid the ultimate price to seek out and tell the truth. And finally, we've just been talking about the high price of doing business in our profession. Now imagine a world without journalists. It's every dictator's dream, at the top of every tyrant's wish list. And as we've seen, in far too many parts of the globe, it is a terrifying reality. The names of those journalists killed in 2012 and those still missing form a roll of honor. As you read them, imagine the stories they might have told.